All right, so we're going to go back into the Theology of the Body text and continue to talk about these themes of shame and the effects of original sin, right? And the effects of concupiscence. All right, so shame, which according to the biblical narrative makes the man and the woman hide their own bodies before each other, and especially their sexual differentiation, confirms that the original power of communicating themselves to each other, about which Genesis 2:25 speaks, has been shattered. So our tendency to hide ourselves from each other in the theological narrative in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3 of covering themselves, it confirms the fact that that original unity has been shattered. Right? Again, the anthropological order, like the first break was with God, the breaking of the covenant with God, and then there's this shattering of the communion of persons between the man and the woman. Reciprocal communion in humanity itself through the body and through its masculinity and femininity is now overturned, as if the body and its masculinity and femininity ceased to be free from suspicion. Right? Cease to be free from suspicion. In the beginning, it was free from suspicion. Right? We had those qualities of openness, transparency. I'm able to reveal myself to this other person. I feel safe with this person. Now, that freedom from suspicion has ceased to be as the substratum of the communion of persons, as if its original function were called into doubt in the consciousness of the man and the woman. Right? As if the original function of our masculinity and femininity is now called into doubt. Right? And so again, we see how he's rereading Genesis 2 and 3 through human experience. Because when we experience shame, when we feel like we're at war with our bodies, when we feel like I don't belong in my body, it calls into doubt the purpose of our masculinity and femininity. And sexual shame in particular, about which Genesis 3:7 speaks, attests to the loss of original certainty that through its masculinity and femininity, the human body is precisely the substratum of the communion of persons. A substratum that simply expresses this communion and serves to realize it. Right? Masculinity and femininity is the substratum of the communion of persons. It's like at the very simplest level, it reveals the fact that we're created for each other. It is as if the personal profile of masculinity and femininity, which beforehand had highlighted the meaning of the body for a full communion of persons, had given up its place to the mere sensation of sexuality with regard to the other human being. It is as if sexuality became an obstacle in man's personal relationship with woman. Okay, and so that personal profile, right, and the meaning of the communion of persons, which is where we're really, when we go back to those four distinctions I gave you from Mark Yarhouse, distinguishing like attraction, admiration from arousal, or like all those levels of intimacy, the carnal level of intimacy, the emotional, personal, and religious levels of intimacy. And now they've been divorced from sensation. And people end up seeking sensation rather than communion. Right? We end up seeking sensation rather than communion. And therefore, our sexuality becomes an obstacle to personal relationships. Right? Because that which reveals the fact that we're created for communion and love now is just a vehicle for sensation, for physical sensation or bodily sensation. You know, that's the danger of over-sexualization of our young people, because they become accustomed to sensation. You know, one of the priests, the French priest that I met in Europe, Father Eric Laquinet, he and the psychologist who wrote their book called Libre pour aimer, which means free for love, They make a big distinction between sensation and emotions. Because when we're caught up in sexual sin, we're really trying to replace our emotional experience with sensation. If somebody is having an emotion, but they don't know how to deal with that emotion, and so they turn to sexual sensation in order to numb the emotion, right? And they're not able to see those two things as distinct, right? To listen to our emotions, respond to them adequately. Instead, there's this constant pursuit of sensation, right? And that becomes the obstacle to personal relationships. A deeper dimension of shame, concupiscence, brings with it an almost constitutive difficulty in identifying oneself with one's own body. Not only in the sphere of one's own subjectivity, but even more so in regard to the subjectivity of the other human being, of woman for man and man for woman. So with concupiscence comes this difficulty in identifying ourselves with our own body, not only just for ourselves, not only I'm not comfortable in my body, but in regard to the subjectivity of the other, which means I'm not comfortable with the way this person's relating to my body. Okay, I'm not comfortable with the way this person's relating to my body, and so that makes me even more uncomfortable in my body. So oftentimes people who have been violated in their bodies turn to things like obesity in order to prevent other people from violating their bodies. Right? I'm not comfortable in my body. I'm not comfortable with the way other people have treated my body. Therefore, I'm going to manipulate my body so that it's not attractive and nobody will ever want to do that again. Right? But it shows forth a discomfort of being in my own body. And there's a need to hide oneself. Right? A need to hide oneself. Andrew Comiskey down in Kansas City, he does a lot of work with people with sexual brokenness, and so he gets all kinds of people. He gets people with gender identity. He gets people gender identity confusion. He gets people with same-sex attraction. He gets people who are sexually abused. He gets people who have trouble with sexual compulsivity, and he has this whole ministry for them. And interestingly, there's one girl that I heard about who was identifying as a male, but when asked the question, how do you see yourself? They said, well, I always saw myself as this big burly guy with a big beard. Which I thought was a really interesting image because it's not the epitome of masculinity. I don't see myself as Arnold Schwarzenegger. I see myself as, a combination of ZZ Top and some big fat guy. My ideal is to be a big fat ZZ Top. Do you know who ZZ Top is? They have really long beards. Okay, but within this context, hence the need to hide oneself. Totally makes sense. Right, why do Franciscans have really long beards? Anybody? To hide themselves, right? Because at a time of persecution in the church, they couldn't be identified when it was illegal to be a priest. And so I'm going to grow this long beard to change my appearance. Right? Why does Santa Claus have a long beard? According to Rankin and Bass, Santa Claus is coming to town from the 1950s because he was an outlaw and he had to grow a beard to change his appearance. So just interesting. Don't any of you guys watch those claymation Christmas things? Okay. It's precisely regard for the subjectivity of the other, and at the same time for one's own subjectivity, it's precisely regard for this that has given rise in this new situation, that is, in the context of concupiscence, the need for hiding oneself, about which Genesis 3:7 speaks. Okay, it's regard for the subjectivity of the other, and at the same time for one's own subjectivity, that we now have this need to hide ourselves in the context of concupiscence. Like, I know that that person is a person in their own self. I'm a person in my own self. I also know because of concupiscence, they have the possibility of violating me, and so I have the need to hide myself. I have a need to protect myself. Okay, and that's important, right? So I'm not saying like everybody should go be completely transparent with everybody, right? Because there are people that can hurt us, and so it's not wise to be completely transparent and vulnerable with everyone. There's discernment in relationships. Is this person a safe person that I want to reveal myself to? You know, we all need somebody in our life that we can have that kind of relationship with. Okay, we need somebody we can have that kind of relationship with. It's not everybody, but we need somebody, or we need some bodies. Okay, oftentimes when we have wounds, we build this disposition, nobody's allowed to know me ever. It's one of my favorite questions to ask in spiritual direction, because my spiritual director asked me once when I was in Rome. He looks at me and goes, "Who knows you?" Right? Who knows you? We need to have people who know us, you know, at least some people who know us. One time a seminarian asked me, "Father, is there like a place where you can just kind of walk in the room and say, this is my stuff?" Because we were talking about the importance of being known by another, and he didn't experience that very much in his peer group. And like there is, right? So again, they're like 12-step fellowships is the place where you can do that. Typically, that's the purpose of them. You walk in, you say, "This is who I am." Everybody says, "Thanks, Bob." And you go outside and drink coffee. All right. Okay, so while my computer's rebooting, does anybody have any other questions for discussion that you want to talk about? Yes.
I just wanted to share a question. We, in 5th grade, discuss all the stuff. The 90 questions and about being on mortal sin. And I think some of the questions from our students, too, is that they're starting to develop this concern about the souls of their parents in this situation. And so, you know, how do you address that when they have those concerns and questions? I'm lucky I can refer to the priests who come and visit, you know, those kinds of questions and kind of let them know about it. But I even have one student who is really concerned about her father who smoked, just cigarettes, but, you know, whether or not that was a sin and, you know.
It's not a sin. Stop telling people smoking is a sin. Yeah, I know. I've heard about it. So anyway, there's this school sister of Christ the King who makes fun of me for smoking all the time. And when I give presentations out there, she makes me a like ashtray with like all these quotes about like the smoke came forth from his nostrils and things like that. But so what do we do when our students are expressing concern for their parents' souls? That's a great question. Okay, so I'm going to say, like, let's say this was happening in an idealistic place where I can wave my magic wand, and this is how it would work. If I could wave my magic wand, a student expresses concern for their parents' souls, right? And then the teacher can take this to their administrator, who's also very concerned about evangelization and reaching out and restoration of family life and things like that. And then the administrator always kind of meets with the pastor, and they're talking about sort of the pastoral initiatives in the parish and what goes on in the parish life. And then the pastor is able to reach out to mom and dad and start to engage mom and dad about, like, where are you in the faith? And, like, how can I help you grow? And, like, who's Jesus in your life? And do you realize who you are in Jesus' life? And, you're choosing to send your child to a Catholic school where they're learning all of these things, and you realize that you're putting your child in this position of conflict by sending them to a school when you don't practice the faith. And how can I help you with that? And to try to call the parents to conversion. That would be the beginning steps if I could wave my magic wand. The idea just popped into my head. There's a form letter that can go home when parents have these kinds of questions, or when students have these kinds of questions. This form letter could go home, and it can just say, Dear Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, it's a joy to have your daughter in class, and we've been talking about whatever topic lately, and they have expressed their concern for you, and your life.
Father, I have comments. I can see some parents, if they receive that letter, being very angry with their child for bringing that up in front of
Yeah, I hear ya.
innocence of the child.
I know. So that's why I'm throwing it out there as an idea, and it's not a mandatory thing. I understand that they could be angry with their child for that. But at the same time, what would be the proper mechanism for calling those parents to conversion and trying to bring them along? Because otherwise we're constantly trying to be the parent of those children, which isn't really our job. But I also I think talking about integrity is a vehicle that can be really helpful. Because when we talk about integrity, and helping the parent to have integrity. When I've had baptisms before, and where they want to ask a family member to be a godparent that doesn't really practice the faith, and then I explain to them okay, so you want to be integral about it, and which means that this person's going to mean what they say when they say it. Or if somebody's a non-Catholic and they're coming to Mass, they shouldn't want to go to communion if they're integral, because they don't believe that the Catholic Church is the true church, and they don't believe in the things that we believe in, so they shouldn't want to go to communion. Because going to communion means that I believe everything that the Catholic Church teaches. That's what going to communion means. Going to communion means, it doesn't even mean I believe that this is Jesus. It means I believe everything the Catholic Church teaches. So if somebody doesn't believe that, then they shouldn't want to go to communion. And there shouldn't be all this sort of I feel so offended that I can't go to communion, because it's just about being integral. So choosing to send their children to a Catholic school needs to be an integral decision on the parent's part. And I would be curious to know why a non-practicing couple would want to send their child to a Catholic school. Why do you want to send your kid to a school where we're teaching your child that missing Mass on Sunday is a serious sin, and you haven't been to Mass on Sunday since 1995? Because it makes it really difficult, and it's causing stress for your child when they hear that. When I give mandatory parent talks, or the talks I do on evangelization and sacramental preparation, I talk about how the hardest thing to teach in our Catholic schools is the third commandment to children of a non-practicing parent. It's the hardest thing to teach. Because, what does keep holy the Sabbath day mean? It means you go to Mass on Sundays. So is it a mortal sin to miss Mass on Sundays? Is that a mortal sin? Well, if you have freedom and you have full knowledge and you make a free act, yes, it's a mortal sin. And if you commit a mortal sin, you go to hell. Yes, if you die in a state where you have full knowledge, it's grave matter, and you have freedom. That's what the Church teaches. And then they have a choice. Either mom and dad are going to hell because that's what they just heard, and my teacher's right, or my parents are really going to be okay and my teacher doesn't really know what they're talking about and everything my teacher says is up for grabs now. Those are their choices, and out of love for their parents, they're going to end up in the second category. So how can we communicate better about making integral choices or helping the parents to live in integrity? North American Martyrs, you have to go to some faith formation if you send your kid to Catholic school. Well, I think it's like one thing in 3 years is the policy. So either a Light of the World retreat or RCIA, or I think they did Alpha last year, at least one round of Alpha. And so that way, like, all the parents have to do something where they might have a chance of coming to know Jesus, which I think is a great idea. If I was a pastor, I would start Alpha in my parish, and when people register for the parish, I would say, I want you to do this 10-week program, and we're going to feed you dinner for 10 weeks. Your kid's a kindergartner, and you probably don't know anybody. You're going to know these people for the next 8 years. They're going to be in school, and we want to give you a chance to get to know the parents of your kids' classmates. And so every week for 10 weeks, you're going to come. We're going to have dinner. There's a little presentation and a discussion. Because I want you to get to know people in the community too. Do you have any couple friends? Well, yeah, we do, but they don't really have kids, and they live across town. Okay, so this is a chance for you to meet couple friends. And just come meet couple friends. And while they're in front of you, I'm going to evangelize you and see where that goes. So there's creative ways of trying to evangelize those parents, because ultimately the parents don't know Jesus, and we need to help introduce them to Jesus. And they're going to be like any adult who doesn't know Jesus, and we try to introduce them to Jesus. They're probably going to say, they're probably going to drop the F-bomb and not want to talk to you because they don't really believe they're lovable. Or they don't feel like they belong, or they don't feel like they're holy enough to fit in with the community. Who knows why they don't participate? And you might discover some things and be able to heal some things, and you never know what might happen. Nothing will happen if we do nothing, though. Right? If nothing changes, nothing changes. And we really don't, there's really not a model for it right now. There's not a model for it right now. The Father John Ricardo in Detroit, they do Alpha, everybody has to do Alpha. The whole parish has to do Alpha. That's what they do. And they have 30 groups go in a week.
What is Alpha?
Alpha's it's a 10-week evangelization program where you just sort of do the big questions, who's Jesus, what is prayer, what does it mean to have a relationship with God? It's the stuff I learned when I went to an evangelical church as a fourth grader and I invited Jesus to be my personal savior. It's kind of those things. And you roll your eyes, but we do need to invite Jesus to be our personal savior if we haven't invited Jesus to be our personal savior. And so anyways. All right, so now I found the right slideshow. So after breaking the original covenant with God, man and woman did not find themselves united with each other, but rather more divided and even set against each other because of their masculinity and femininity. They're no longer called to union and unity, but are also threatened by the insatiability of that union and unity, which does not cease to attract man and woman, precisely because they are person called from eternity to exist in communion. So now they're threatened by the insatiability of the union and unity, right? They're called to be in communion, and so that call to communion is still part of us even though we have original sin, and even though our desires are disordered, but now that call to communion becomes insatiable because I want to move towards communion with this person, but they don't fulfill me because God was the one who was supposed to fulfill me. Right? And that concupiscence that disorders the relationship between men and women, right? It started with the break with God, the break with the covenant with God. In Genesis 3:16, the Lord says to Eve, "Your desire shall be for your husband, but he will dominate you." And the explanation of this shame should not be sought in the body itself, in the somatic sexuality of both, but it goes back to the deepest transformations suffered by the human spirit. Okay, it's not simply a matter of the body, right? But it's within the entirety of the person. In their consciousness, they shift the blame to the body, right? And we kind of blame all of this rupture in the relationships between men and women. We can blame it all on sex and sexuality, but it really goes back to something deeper. Because the shame they experience is a secondary experience. It reveals the moment of concupiscence, but it also provides weapons ahead of time against the consequences of the threefold component of concupiscence. Okay, so again, there's that positive and negative aspects of shame, right? It reveals the fact that we're broken, that there's a rupture in relationship, but it also reveals the fact that we need to protect the dignity that we carry with us as persons. Right? We need to protect our dignity. We need to protect what is the image of God in us. Later, the experience of such domination shows itself more directly in the woman as the insatiable desire for a different union. From the moment in which the man dominates her, the communion of persons, which consists in the spiritual unity of the two subjects who gave themselves to each other, is replaced by a different mutual relationship, namely by a relationship of possession of the other as an object of one's own desire. So instead of that union, now it's replaced by a relationship of possession. Right? He will dominate you, means that he'll possess you as if you were an object, as an object of his desire. Right? When we talk about objectifying people, it means that we just kind of see them as an object of our desire, or our fulfillment, or our entertainment, or somebody to pass time. The human body has almost lost the power of expressing this love in which the human person becomes a gift. Right? He says almost lost the power. Right? Almost lost the power. It's not that it completely ruptured our ability to express love as a gift. Right? But the Holy Father uses this word almost. In Italian, it's quasi. The spousal meaning of the body has not become totally foreign to the human heart. It's not been totally suffocated in it by concupiscence, but only habitually threatened. Right? So when I'm doing salvation history and I say, like, after original sin, things became distorted as opposed to bad or evil or permanently damaged or broken, it became distorted because there's still something there that's true. Right? There's still something there that's true. So, like, is the family of Israel a family? Yes, the family of Israel is a family. It's not the family. It's not the fullness of family. It's not the ideal family, but it's still a family. And more we have to affirm that, because when we teach, like, a family is a mother, father, and their natural children, and marriage is permanent, and divorce is not the plan of God, then, as you've all pointed out, the first questions that come up in a child's mind is, well, then what do I have? You know, they do have a family, and they have a family that's in need of redemption, like all our families are in need of redemption. Right? The spousal meaning of the body is not totally foreign. It's not been totally suffocated, but habitually threatened. So concupiscence, this word we use to describe our state after original sin, deprives man, one could say, of the dignity of the gift, which is expressed by his body through femininity and masculinity, and in some sense depersonalizes man, making him an object for the other. Right? Depersonalizes. Depersonalization's a term rooted in the philosophy of Martin Buber, and Emmanuel Mounier uses it a lot. I wrote my thesis on Emmanuel Mounier. And so it really means that there are certain aspects of being a human person that become stifled in us. And so we no longer see ourselves as transcendent and open to things that are above. We no longer see ourselves as created for communion. We no longer see ourselves as free. We lose the ability to confront. Right? We lose the ability to confront. Right? Freedom is the ability to say no to things. Right? True freedom is the ability to say no to things. It's not the ability to say yes to whatever I want. It's the ability to say no. People who lack freedom can't say no. Which would be a good and interesting quiz question for a junior high kid, right? Which of the following is necessary for a free person? The ability to say yes, the ability to say no, the ability to do whatever you want and just see what they answer. Because I doubt they will answer the ability to say no. Concupiscence also casts doubt on the fact that each man and woman are willed by the Creator for himself. Right? It casts doubt on the fact that we have dignity in ourselves. And we start to look for our dignity in others. Right? I only have value if I have a girlfriend. I only have value if I have a boyfriend. I only have value if I have a PlayStation. I only have value if I'm communicating by Snapchat. Which is the most ironic oxymoron statement you could ever make. Right? I only have dignity if I'm able to take pictures of myself that gets shared anonymously all over the internet. Concupiscence also limits and restricts self-mastery from within, and thereby, in some sense, makes the interior freedom of the gift impossible. Right? If we lack self-mastery, we cannot give ourselves freely. Okay? We can't say yes unless we can say no. We can't say yes unless we can say no. Okay? If I say yes to going to lunch with Father Jarofsky today, I have to say no to going to lunch with all of you and everybody else in the city of Lincoln. Right? That's how that works. When two people get married, they say yes to one person, and simultaneously it's implied that they have said no to every other person in the world. Right? That's how a priest explained celibacy to me once. He said, if you get married, you have to say no to every single woman in the world except for one. And if you become celibate, you only have to say no to one more. Right? It's not that big a deal. Okay, the relationship of the gift changes into a relationship of appropriation. So because of concupiscence, instead of the relationship of the gift, now it's a relationship of appropriation, like I own you for myself. And you belong to me as if you were property. The main point is perhaps not that it is above all the woman who becomes an object of desire on the part of the man, but rather, as we stressed before, that the man ought to have been, from the beginning, the guardian of the reciprocity of the gift and of its true balance. Okay, so not so much that the woman became the object of desire for the man, but that the man ceased to be the guardian of the gift. Right? The guardian of the reciprocity of the gift. Okay, this is why in maintaining the balance in the relationship, there seems to be a particular responsibility that's given to men. And then he starts to reflect on the pronoun my. Right? My, like when we say my love, or you are mine, or the sense of belonging. My is a pronoun that denotes possession of an object, like my computer. It means it's my computer, it's not your computer. And you can't use my computer because it's mine. Yet in the language of love, my denotes reciprocal unity. Right? It denotes reciprocal unity. Belonging to one another. Like when we say, my love. In the Song of Songs, when it says, my sister, my bride, it denotes a sense of belonging to the other person. When we sing that song, You Are Mine, it means that we belong to the Lord. And there's a sense of reciprocal union. But concupiscence robs the word my of that meaning, right? With concupiscence, when we use the word my, it doesn't have that meaning of reciprocal belonging. When we have that perspective of sin, it turns into you are my object that is there to fulfill my desires. In the next few audiences, John Paul II breaks down the words that Jesus uses in Matthew 5:27. So do not commit adultery. By adultery, it was understood the possession of another's wife. That's what adultery meant in the Old Testament law. So adultery was committed if you had relations with the wife of another person. But not the possession of other women as wives next to the first one. Going back to that question of how do we talk about polygamy in the Old Testament, right? In the Old Testament, adultery was defined very strictly as taking another person's wife, but it wasn't applied to having 4 wives or having 2 wives and 2 concubines as Jacob did. However, also with regard to adultery, there was an analogy between adultery and idolatry. And it points to the covenant that's accompanied by love. Right? So in the prophets always talk about idolatry as if it's adultery. So Hosea, again, God tells Hosea, go and marry this prostitute, Gomer, so that you know what it is to have an unfaithful bride. Because the people of Israel have been worshiping at the altars of Baal. And when you worship a false god, you're committing adultery. So idolatry and adultery are connected. In the prophets, adultery is a sin because it's the breaking of a covenant. In the legislative texts in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, it's a violation of property rights. Okay, so we can see that in the Old Testament, the way that this understanding is presented, right? In the legislative text, it's a violation of property rights. So if somebody takes the wife of another, he's taken their property. That's what's wrong with it. In the prophets, though, it's the violation of a covenant. It's the breaking of a covenant that's accompanied by love. One can speak of moral good and evil according to whether this relationship makes such a unity of the body true, and whether or not it gives to that unity the character of a truthful sign. In this case, therefore, we can judge adultery as a sin in conformity with the act's objective content. So, John Paul II's morality is always going to be based on the logic of a truthful sign. Okay, the logic of a truthful sign. So marriage is an image of Christ's love for the church. Christ's love for the church is irrevocable, it's exclusive, it's permanent. Therefore, anything that is not irrevocable, exclusive, and permanent is a violation of the truthful sign, right? It's not a truthful sign. That's the logic that he uses. Okay, so why is contraception wrong according to that logic? Because the marital act is this moment in which I give myself entirely to the other person, just as Christ has given himself entirely to the church. And if I hold back any aspect of myself, it's no longer a truthful sign. Because Jesus didn't say, I'm going to give you all of myself except for this part. And so we don't say, I'm going to give you all of myself except for my fertility, or I'm going to give you all of myself until you get fat, or I'm going to give you all of myself unless you are mean to me. It means I'm going to give you all of myself. Right? When he talks about what conjugal love is a re-speaking of the marriage vows through the language of the body. Right? When you get married, you say, I take you as my husband, I take you as my wife, with the language, with spoken language, right? And your vows make you married. Then conjugal love says, I take you as my husband, I take you as my wife, through the language of the body. Right? Your bodies speak that through that act of love. Therefore, conjugal love is always the renewal of the marriage vows that were spoken at the altar. And it has to be spoken in truth. Right? It has to be spoken in truth. So anything that violates the truth, the truthfulness of the sign, right, turns the act into a lie. Right? This is why, by the way, that we don't actually do, like, it's one of the reasons to not do renewal of marriage vows. Like, when you don't like say the words. I know people do it, but it's actually not in the liturgical books to have renewal of marriage vows where two people get up and they say, I take you as my husband, I take you as my wife, because that's the sacramental form that made you married. And it's not repeatable. But the renewal of the marriage vows happens all of the time, well, as often as it happens, through the language of the body. And that's part of the dignity of sexuality within marriage. Right? It's part of the dignity of sexuality within marriage. Right? It's also a reason, it's one argument, maybe a more beautiful argument, against having premarital sexual relations, because you're saying something with your body that you're not willing to say already in vows. And things get out of order. Or when people are cohabiting and they're on engaged encounter, I always point that out, that after marriage, this is what conjugal love means. And how are you going to distinguish what it means after marriage from what it's meant up until now, unless you stop and restart again and let it become something new for you? And oftentimes that argument, people say, oh, Father, that makes sense. Okay, we're willing to do that. But they still need somebody to walk with them and through that. Okay, one can speak of moral good and evil according to whether this relationship makes such a unity of the body true, and whether or not it gives to that unity the character of a truthful sign. In this case, therefore, we can judge adultery as a sin in conformity with the act's subjective content. That was the same quote. So Jesus says, whoever looks at a woman with lust, whoever looks to desire, which points to the inner state of the man of concupiscence. Because a look expresses what is in the heart. Right? Where we look expresses what's in the heart. Concupiscence becomes a detachment from the spousal meaning of the body, and that desire represents a reduction in an intentional reduction or restriction, as it were, a closure of the horizon of the mind and heart. And so when we look at a person as to desire them, when we look at a person with lust, it closes the horizon of the mind and the heart. Right? It reduces the spousal meaning of the body and constricts it just under that phenomenological dimension of the body. Whoever looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery in the heart. So again, in Audience 42, he points out that he's reflected on what it means to commit adultery, what it means to desire, to commit adultery in the body, and to commit adultery in the heart. Adultery in the heart is not committed only because the man looks in this way at a woman who is not his wife, but precisely because he looks in this way at a woman. Even if he were to look in this way at the woman who is his wife, he would commit the same adultery in the heart. This was one of the most scandalous things John Paul II said when he was giving these audiences, that it's possible even within marriage for a man to look at a woman with lust, or to approach her with lust in his heart, or to commit adultery in his heart even with his wife if he objectifies her within the marriage covenant. Okay, because we're always called to a purification of love even within marriage. It's not like, okay, we're married, now whatever we do, we do. But we're always trying to grow in that love and appreciation and realization of the truthful sign. If he treats her only as an object for the satisfaction of drives, a husband commits adultery in the heart with his own wife. Or the wife commits adultery in her heart with her husband. Okay, so if we have a reductive view of sexuality, we end up with a lot of married couples who just treat each other as somebody who's there to satisfy their drives. In this last section, under Historical Man Fallen, John Paul II reflects a bit on the Manichaean heresy, where the body is seen as an anti-value. Right? Manichaeism is sort of this belief that the material world is bad and the spiritual world is good, and there's this total split. Therefore, it leads to that kind of Puritanism where sex is bad and things of the spirit are good. And so the body is seen as an anti-value. That's not the Catholic position. In Matthew 5:27, we see an example where that value is not sufficiently appreciated, where we don't see the entirety of the human person in front of us. So concupiscence is the result of the fall, is that we don't fully appreciate the value of the body and of the person. Right? It's not a complete split where from that point forward the material world is evil and the spiritual world is good. And so as we look at the words of Christ, we recognize we have to contend with those habits of Manichaeism, or that habit that we culturally can look at the material world as if it's bad, or the body having an anti-value. Right? Christ calls us to a real and deep victory over lust, and purity must mature from that sort of negative turning away to the positive assertion of the value and dignity of the body and sex. And so I've just made this transition to these slides that are much simpler, that are really old. So when I use that idea of negative and positive purity, that's what it refers to is like negative purity is when you have continence but not virtue, right? So when I'm trying to control my desires, I'm trying to control myself, and so I like look away from anything that forms a temptation, right? Positive purity is when I see the value of the person that is in front of me. Right? And so some people who have struggled with sexual sin for a very long time in their life, they have a habit of objectifying people, and they have to go through this period of, I can't look at people or else I'm going to objectify them. But we want to get to a point of purity where like we can look at somebody and say, that's a beautiful person, and thank God for that beautiful person, and I'm going to go on with my day, and they have no control over me, and I also am not controlled by my desires or my impulses. And I'm able to see the beauty of the person in front of me. And so lust hasn't completely suffocated the nuptial meaning of the body, only habitually threatened it. Okay, so we are going to break because I just am hitting into, this next section on redemption. Okay, so we'll break for about 10 minutes and then come back we'll start talking about redemption and then take questions if there's any questions left, but we had a lot of questions already.